We're going to have a panel, but for some framing remarks about this panel, let me introduce Tara Strada, who is the national chair of the 9/11 Families United. Terry?
Thank you. I'd first like to thank everyone in this room for all of the work that you do in keeping America safe. It is an honor to be here today and to speak on the significance of using the federal courts of the United States to hold accountable the perpetrators and sponsors of acts of terrorism. My husband, Tom Strada, was murdered on September 11th, 2001, in the North Tower of the World Trade Center. He left behind 3 children who were 7, 4, and 4 days old. I think yesterday is still with me. For over 2 decades, I have been advocating for a path to justice for the 9/11 community by using our civil justice system to expose the underbelly of terrorism and to establish the liability of those who supported and sponsored such depravity against innocent people. Using laws enacted by Congress for this purpose, victims' families and the injured survivors can seek to hold accountable the people, groups, and nations who bankroll terrorism and spread the hate-filled ideology that inspires jihadists to carry out murderous terrorist attacks like September 11th. Our national security is enhanced when we empower the victims of terrorism to pursue judgments against those who provide material support and otherwise aid and abet terrorism. That policy objective was core to the Anti-Terrorism Act when it was enacted in 1991, and it remains the central goal of the 9/11 community in asserting claims against al-Qaeda sponsors. I heard earlier today, I believe from John Miller, one way to combat terrorism is to follow the money. That is exactly what our legal team did, and almost all roads led to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Suing the kingdom in civil litigation has been challenging, but with the work of our dedicated representatives, support from Congress, and the relentless work of 9/11 victims advocates like myself and Brett Eagleson here today, we have made tremendous progress in our quest for justice. Because of the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, JASTA, enacted in 2016 to ensure the 9/11 community could have our day in court in the unprecedented 9/11 lawsuit against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, jurisdictional discovery was ordered, and damning, never-before-seen evidence with crucial details about Saudi Arabia's complicity in the 9/11 attacks was unveiled during oral arguments this summer in a New York federal court. I'd like to pause here and add, this evidence was never given to the 9/11 Commission. Although it was in the FBI's possession just weeks after 9/11, and although it was mandated for the FBI to hand over everything to the commissioners, it was never received by the 9/11 Commission. What was revealed in federal court on July 31st profoundly changes the 9/11 narrative. While the 9/11 Commission on a whole had a lot of the facts right, its analysis and conclusions are considerably flawed, namely because it never had the evidence that confirms the kingdom's role in murdering our loved ones and injuring thousands more. This evidence is indisputable, and the kingdom can no longer expect our government to continue providing them cover. The years and decades of dodging responsibility are over. All government agencies and the White House need to prioritize holding Saudi Arabia accountable for its role in 9/11 and take a very close look at the evidence. It is astonishing. The evidence confirms that the kingdom deployed its government agents to the United States, some with diplomatic credentials, some with ties to al-Qaeda, and some with both, to plan, plot, and carry out the September 11th attacks. Now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the tide has turned in our favor. The momentum is growing, and there is no turning back. Holding the kingdom accountable no longer feels like a remote possibility. It is now a reality that we are getting closer to achieving. No victim of terrorism, of a terrorist attack, should ever have to question whether they are fully supported by the DOJ, FBI, and CIA. all of our national security entities have dragged their feet on releasing evidence. Far too often, our government has not stepped up when we needed it, and we have been used as a bargaining chip with the kingdom through all the presidencies of post-9/11 era. This duplicity is largely to blame for the prolonged delays we have faced. I want to thank Senator Blumenthal, who just spoke, along with Senators John Cornyn, Chuck Schumer, and Chuck Grassley, who have been tireless champions for our quest for justice. These lawmakers enacted JSTA to amend the Anti-Terrorism Act, but sometimes laws need to be tweaked, and now Congress must once again strengthen counterterrorism legislation by passing the bipartisan Ensuring Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act to ensure that nations that aid and abet terrorism are held accountable. Passing the EJVTA will ensure greater civil discovery that will expose more broadly the truth about support for 9/11 and al-Qaeda. It is essential that the EJVTA is enacted very soon. With the right laws at our disposal, with a Department of Justice that fully commits to transparency, and with courts that apply the laws robustly, victims of terrorism can achieve genuine breakthroughs, making terrorism financing a priority and punishing those who sponsor terrorism against Americans. Our fight is not just about the past. It is about safeguarding our future. Every obstacle to truth, every delay in justice, every concession to political expediency sends a dangerous message to our enemies that America's resolve can be worn down, that accountability can be evaded. Never forget is not just passive remembrance. It is a call to action. The 9/11 attacks struck at the heart of our nation. Our response must be equally profound. We owe it to those we lost, to their families, and to future generations to uncover the truth about every facet of this tragedy, hold all responsible parties accountable, and ensure justice is served. Thank you.
Terry's comments set us up for where we're going here. You know, we've spent the day today talking about the effect of terrorist attacks, those who fight it, those who try to prevent it, and this is a discussion about giving voices, bringing a voice to those who often don't get a voice in the critical discussions, and that is the victims of those terrorist attacks. But this takes us back to where we are. right here in the shadow of the World Trade Center and 9/11. And as Terry framed so eloquently, so passionately, and with more than a little anger, there's answers that have been coming, and there are answers that are being held back, and they want to get to the bottom of it. So our panel is Mr. Brett Eagleson, president of 9/11 Justice. This is their very focus. Dennis Fitzpatrick, senior legal advisor for the Soufan Group. Charlie Savage, a good colleague and correspondent from the New York Times. And Terry Strada, who you just heard from, who will be joining the panel to reinforce that. And of course, our moderator will be another good friend and a guy who's been on this story since before the beginning, Mike Isikoff, who's been with Newsweek, NBC, Yahoo News, and a number of publications, and is a renowned author. Welcome our panel.
That pushes it on. All right. Thank you, John, and thank you, Terry, for those opening remarks. I mean, this is, in many ways, the most emotional panel we're going to have because we're talking about accountability for the people who did what they did on 9/11. And also, in some ways, we're talking about some of the trickiest political, diplomatic, and legal issues as part of this discussion. So I want to start out, and also, by the way, the two developments we're going to talk about today, there's been a lot of news on both fronts, and just in the last several weeks, which is pretty astounding when you think about we're talking about an event from 23 years ago. But I want to start out with Charlie, because he's been covering legal developments related to 9/11 for many years now. And just this summer, we had the Defense Department Military Commission Office announced that they had struck a plea deal with the defendants before the military commissions. Big public uproar about that. 2 days later, Secretary Austin rescinds the plea deal. And so bottom line is, here we are, 23 years after the worst mass murder in American history, and nobody has been put on trial for perpetuating it. How did we end up in a situation like this, Charlie?
That's a lot of. Is this working?
Press it.
Oh, there it is. Well, that's a long saga to squeeze into one answer, and I won't try to filibuster my way through the first 15 minutes of this panel to tell it in detail. But I think anyone who works in this business, like everyone in this audience, knows that there was, after 9/11, the thought in the Bush administration that this was an opportunity to have tough justice, and the creation of the military commission system was supposed to ensure that there would be rough and ready justice for the perpetrators of the atrocity. It was kind of a brainchild, actually, of Bill Barr, who had been interested in it going back to Pan Am 103 and called up some of his people, even though he wasn't in government then, and suggested it to the Bush administration. And that set off a grand debate about civil liberties versus national security that weirdly continues to kind of residually have a stink over the system, even though it has long since become clear that that's the wrong conversation. And it's really one of, before you can even get to that conversation, it's a question of pragmatism and what works. And it's simply demonstrably evident that the attempt to create a new criminal justice system from scratch at Guantanamo has not worked and has been dysfunctional and has created endless opportunities for the whole system to tie itself in knots, arguing over the rules and the processes and all this sort of untested stuff. And meanwhile, the supposedly weak Article III civilian court system continues to lock up terrorists in quick and orderly fashion in ways that can sustain appeal. And so even though it's been evident for at least a decade now that the tribunal system doesn't work, the politics along the way have turned this into a sort of a Gordian knot that has proved increasingly frustrating for anyone who's trying to resolve the situation. Around 2011, Congress enacted a law that bars bringing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or anyone who's ever been at Guantanamo to the United States for any reason, which complicates, to say the least, the prospect of just bringing them here and charging them before a court that works. And after many years of no progress at Guantanamo, it looked like, as you referred to this summer, that there was at least going to be some closure as a bow to reality that this thing was never going to get to trial, or if it did ever somehow result in a conviction, it would be overturned on appeal for myriad reasons, only for, at the 11th hour, the Secretary of Defense to come in and at least purport to pull it back. And it's just sort of, it's like a synecdoche of Guantanamo. It's like if he had wanted to kill it, he should have done it, nipped it in the bud 2 years ago before things got this far. It remains inexplicable to every observer inside and outside the government that I've spoken to how this could have happened, that he let it get this far only to come in and then create a whole other issue that now, as we speak, they're down at Guantanamo arguing about whether this was even legally possible for him to do. So here comes another 8 months of arguments and wheel spinning.
The fundamental problem, though, was that very early on, a decision was made at the highest levels that the priority when we captured any al-Qaeda detainees was not going to be to bring them to justice and develop evidence for a trial, but intelligence, and we were going to use extra legal methods to get that intelligence, i.e. waterboarding and other methods that most people now agree was amounted to torture. Dennis, was that the right decision by the government? By the Bush administration at the time?
To send the cases to the military commission?
No, to prioritize the gleaning of intelligence through extra legal methods rather than developing evidence to bring them to trial.
No, it's a great question. I'm going to carve it into two, right? And the first instance, you know, the enhanced interrogation program was horrific, right? It did a lot of damage in our standing within the world. It made no sense in terms of a prosecution standpoint. It made no sense from an intelligence gathering standpoint. And we really should thank our host, Ali Soufan, who was at the forefront of the criticism of that program. And he deserves enduring respect for taking a very bold position at the time when 9/11 was very, very raw. So, you know, the first answer is that, you know, the enhanced interrogation program was just ill-conceived, it was ill-implemented, and it has had lasting negative consequences in my view. Now, the second part of your question, the prioritizing of intelligence gathering over prosecution, that exists today. That is ongoing. And it is still the protocol. I won't necessarily call it the policy, but it is still the protocol when a terrorist is apprehended, typically overseas, and there has been sort of parallel investigations. There's been an intelligence, military, agency process underway, while at the same time there's been a DOJ, FBI, prosecution lane. It is still the protocol to take the person through an intelligence gathering session. Now, and there's been debates.
But we don't waterboard them.
No, that ended.
And that's the fundamental problem, right? That's what's bogged down these military commissions in endless hearings, which is how we treated them. And then we sent them to Guantanamo afterwards and got confessions from the FBI. But to what extent were those confessions tainted? And to what extent was how we treated them, does that taint the whole process?
Correct. And it's terribly complicated. And I don't want to get too wonky, but there is a way to send in the so-called clean team after there's been sort of a dirty interrogation. And by the way, the current methods, post 2006, 2007, intelligence interviews still take place, but they take place in a lawful manner. They do not take place in my view, an unlawful manner. But there is a process under the law that has been tested repeatedly. It's something called the Elstead Doctrine, and there's a process where if there's sufficient attenuation from the original unmirandized interview, and circumstances have changed, and you can demonstrate voluntariness and an appropriate Miranda warning, that the subsequent interviews are admissible in an Article III court in a criminal trial.
So a major purpose of having a trial is accountability for the perpetrators, but also justice for the victims and the victims of the families. Brett, your father was killed on 9/11. You've been a major spokesman for the families ever since. When the plea deal, now the Pentagon had announced, the Office of Military Commissions had announced over a year ago that they were going to enter into plea deal discussions. But then, and then we hadn't heard anything more, and then at the end of July, one day, out of the blue, they make the announcement that they have struck this plea deal, which would take death for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, and 5 co-defendants, the death penalty off the table. Were you briefed on that before the Office of Military Commissions announced it? And if not, what was your reaction when you saw that?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank Ali for having me here, and just what an honor it is to be amongst a room of such esteemed members of law enforcement, counterterror, and just to sort of level set here, I have zero experience in anything you guys do. I write loans for a living, so if anybody wants cheap interest rates, see me in the back room. Sort of stumbled my way into advocacy, unfortunately, for the loss of my father, and I got involved about 8 years ago with Senator Blumenthal, working on the ensuring justice for sponsors of terrorism law. But to answer your question, Mike, no, we were not consulted. And I think that's one of our biggest grievances, is our community is the community that is the single most affected and grieved by what happened on 9/11. And as we sit here today, in the shadows of the pools, in the shadows of the towers, 50 feet away, it's 23 years. We still don't have justice. We still don't have the full answers. We still don't have an executive branch of government who has been willing to help us pursue the truth and the facts. It's been brought to light, it's been fought back on, and were it not for people like Terry Strada and the other family advocates and myself, we wouldn't know what we do know today. And the fact that the DOD chose to enter into these plea deals without consultation with us is just another example of the way that we've been treated as a class of victims. And there is not a good answer. There really isn't. If we go to trial, could the evidence be thrown out because it's tainted? Well, that's a very real risk. If you put them to death, there's a lot of people, if you polled our community, there's a lot of people that'll say, well, if they want to be put to death, we shouldn't put them to death. We don't really know truly what they want. So it's a really hard question to answer. It's above my pay grade. But I think where our perspective lies is we want to be consulted. We want to be thought of. We don't want to hear from a MSNBC news report that a plea deal has been struck. I don't want to get a text message while I'm walking out of the Southern District of Court in Manhattan after we had an amazing day presenting our evidence against Saudi Arabia for everything the kingdom did to support the hijackers. I don't want to then get a text message from a bunch of family members talking to me about a plea deal. No, let's focus on our pain and let's focus on the work that we've been doing about bringing to light the facts that our government knew very early on what Saudi Arabia did, and have our perspective at heart.
I want to dive into the Saudi Arabia story in a minute, but just sticking on the plea deal and the Office of Military Commissions. Terry, same question to you. Did you have a heads up that this plea deal announcement was coming? And if not, what was your reaction when you saw it?
No, I was not consulted either or given a heads up. My organization consists of over 10,000 victims' family members from 9/11, and nobody was called or consulted. So as Brett was saying, it was a shock to us to hear that it had happened, and we had a very strong, knee-jerk reaction. And I believe part of why Austin, is it Colonel Austin? Colonel Austin? Secretary Austin came back and made his decision within 72 hours was because of the strong response he was getting from the 9/11 community. So the problems that we had with the way it was handled is that we were being told that the death penalty was being taken off the table so in return or in exchange for them pleading guilty. Well, if you've been to Guantanamo Bay like I have and many families have been, they pled guilty. We know that as soon as we get there. They pled guilty. There's no remorse. If they had an opportunity to do it again, they would. So what were we getting for this plea deal? They were getting what they wanted, not the death penalty. We were getting nothing. The other thing that was extremely upsetting was that this was happening on the same day that the Russian prisoner swap was on television. Our first response was, well, what's going to happen to the evidence, right? Where does all that evidence go? Are we going to see it? Is it going to come to us for what we're doing here in the United States against the kingdom? Is the American people going to get to see the evidence? Or is the evidence going to be buried? So we were concerned about that. With the Russian prisoner swap going on, nobody told us where this life sentence was going to be handled, right? Where were they going? Supermax prison in Colorado? Were they going to get to stay at Country Club Gitmo, where they have everything they want? Or were they going to truly be punished somewhere and put in a hole somewhere, which is where the solitary confinement procedures are at the max prisons? But what was really concerning to us was this prisoner swap that we're watching. So where was the guarantee that this administration, the next administration, we change every 4 years. 4 more years, another administration. Were Americans going to have targets on their back? Was somebody going to kidnap an American family, hold them hostage, torture them because they want these prisoners out of jail? They're heroes in their community. They have a following. People want them out of jail and back in their country, which is another thing. Were they going to be extradited to their country for their punishment? We knew nothing, but that fear of them being released somewhere in the future in exchange, because remember, it was the bad guys for good guys, the bad guys for good guys. And were Americans going to have a target on their back to get those individuals out of prison someday? So we needed those answers. We didn't have them, and nobody offered them up to us. Right. But I do believe Austin realized it's an election year, and he didn't want that on his plate, the 9/11 families raising all of these questions and answers publicly.
Charlie, Terry raised the question of we didn't even know if there was such a plea deal where the 9/11 prisoners would serve their sentence, which is a good question because, as I understand it, Congress has passed a law that explicitly says under no circumstances can any of them be brought into the United States, which presumably means they couldn't serve a sentence in Supermax in Colorado, correct?
That's right, with the qualifier that Congress could change that law. She's saying, 5-10 years from now, what's the circumstance? Who's going to be in charge?
Right.
Gitmo is colossally expensive for what is now, 31 prisoners who are left. And sticking them into Florence Supermax would save the taxpayers $5 million per prisoner a year or something like that. It's insane. And so while but I do think that this, what's going to happen to them and under what conditions are they going to be held is absolutely one of the great questions. And that was part of the negotiations with the defense for the prisoners because she's right, they wanted to stay, especially I believe a key asking point was they wanted to be able to eat and pray communally as they do now, and which is obviously not
Which
what
I don't
life
think
is
you
like
can
in
do in
Florence.
Supermax. Right.
Yes, and so, but in exchange, that stop the bleeding of this process that has been going on forever and is not working.
Now, of course, in 2009, there was an attempt to bring these defendants to the United States and try them in federal court. Dennis, that's what you do for a living, prosecute terrorists in federal court. Would that have worked? And wouldn't the same issues about waterboarding and torture and their treatment be as much of an obstacle in federal court as it's been before these military commissions?
I don't think so, and for several reasons. The short answer to your question is yes. I mean, I believe the 5 defendants should have been transferred to the Southern District of New York. There was an indictment returned in 2009. It's a robust indictment. It went through an exacting DOJ protocol. It adhered to the principles of federal prosecution. There was a really good team of prosecutors between the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of Virginia who investigated the case in conjunction with the Guantanamo task force that had been reviewing the cases of all the detainees. What I can say about the department, and not as sort of a cheerleader for the department, because I've certainly had my issues over the time, but I will say this. When they decide to indict a case, they have gone through the Justice Manual, right? They've adhered to the principles of federal prosecution, which means that you can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. There's this sort of perception out there generally that the department sort of goes on a probable cause stand and we'll just throw it up there and then see what happens. That doesn't happen, and it certainly doesn't happen in terrorism cases. Because the one thing you do not want to do is charge a terrorist and then have a really lousy prosecution with an acquittal or a split verdict or anything like that. There is a lot of attention placed on it. And I want to go back to what Charlie said about pragmatism. I think it goes to your question, Michael. The reason why is because those institutions and those protocols are in place, right? We've done this before. And it sort of ties into what Brett and Terry were saying about the victim notification. I've read about those issues that you both have discussed. I'm dumbfounded to hear it in person. I mean, as you were speaking, if my jaw didn't drop, it should have. That's just unconscionable. That just should not happen. And Diane Foley is here, and she knows that in the Cody and El-Sheikh case, Alexander Cody pled guilty, El-Shafi El-Sheikh went to trial. They were responsible for the murders of Jim Foley, Kayla Mueller, Peter Kassig, and Stephen Sotloff. The plea negotiations with Alexander Cody evolved over a period of several weeks, and it was a very unique plea. And federal plea agreements are convoluted, sometimes unnecessarily so. But Diane will remember when it finally looked like we were going to reach an agreement, we flew in all the families and we sat them in a conference room and we went over line by line. The thing is like 15 pages long, 20 plus paragraphs, line by line, answered every single question. We spent hours with them, better part of a day, and we reached a consensus that this was the right thing to do. If there had been a dissenting voice, we would have suspended it and we would have kept working on it. So what I hear you say really resonates loudly with me. But the point to really the high level point and sort of the cheerleading for Article III courts and prosecution is that we've done it before. And I think what we've seen in the military commissions, both in the lack of victim attention, but also just the unusual amount of time, is they're making it up as they're going along. right? They don't really know, they don't have the precedents, they don't have the institutions in place to do it properly or efficiently.
Could I add two things real quick on both of that point? One is, these are unrelated, but spinning off of what you just said. One is the 9/11 case is one of the things that makes it so hard is there are so many victims.
Right.
When you have a handful of victims, like with the Beatles case you were just talking about, you can fly everyone in, you can keep it quiet,
True.
you can brief them, one person, you can try to get unanimity.
We can still
in
get
the
an
room.
email, though.
Yeah, there's
We don't have
no-
to fly to Guantanamo. We
There's
can still have
no
an
way
email.
with thousands of victim families. So, I mean, we at the New York Times knew that was coming that
But they
day.
could send an email.
And we were working on it, and they knew that we
The
were
New York
working on
Times
it.
shouldn't know before we know.
Well, the point is, the minute the thousands of you know, someone will leak it to the Times or whoever.
But who cares?
Well, I'm just saying, so that therefore they have
are
to
you
put out a
defending the fact that we
statement.
weren't notified before?
They have to put out a statement explaining what's going on when people start clamoring for it. And it's just, there's no,
Yeah, but
this is one of those things where there is no good
This
answer.
can't come out of the thin blue air that we don't even know the details of a plea deal. And the other thing I'll say is what a plea deal does, which I think is the biggest point here, is it takes a trial off the table. Now, the wheels of justice turn slow, but they turn exceedingly fine. And if you look at what we've done with our trial in civil court, we've uncovered all the evidence. What happens to the evidence? What happens to what these people know if they sign a plea deal? What they do is they take 9/11, they put it in a cute little box on a shelf, and then they forget about it. And we don't know anything what happens because they sign a plea deal, they slap each other on the backs, and everybody goes home. But we're left stuck here.
Isn't it the case, though, that the plea deal
So-
was going to have them testifying about and
I don't
answering
know.
questions
I
of
don't know.
families?
I didn't see the.
Exactly. How
Did
do
the
we
New
know?
York Times see the plea deal? Because I didn't.
It actually, as I read it, it didn't say that they would testify. It said that the families would have the opportunity to present questions.
And that was ridiculous. Can you imagine, let's become pen pals with KS?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
and
and
is-
everything that
and-
he writes is going to be censored. So
Right,
what
whether
would be
that
the
would be
point?
in open court, under oath,
No,
could be
they're-
challenged or
And
cross-examined,
at that
we
point,
don't know.
and at that point, they've already signed the paperwork. Who cares?
Right.
What motivation do they have to tell the truth?
Exactly.
They've already got their deal.
Let's get to your case, because the truth is, while this seemingly endless military commission proceedings have been going on in Gitmo, there's also been this seemingly endless case that you and other families have been bringing against the Saudi government in federal court in New York. And what's astounding is we have just learned a whole chunk of new evidence about 9/11 that wasn't available to the 9/11 Commission that really raises some serious questions about the full story of what happened. Terry alluded to it in her opening remarks, but Brett, take us through what that new evidence is and why it's as significant as you believe it is.
Well, what I think is also pretty astounding is the lack of attention in the mainstream media of what we've produced. And I'd be curious to know, if we could poll the room, how many people in this room are aware of the fact that we now have a video that was given to us by the British government, not the US government, despite the fact that we have a Biden presidential executive order. We've obtained a video that was seized by the British police and given to us, which is an FBI-confirmed Saudi intelligence operative casing the United States Capitol. CBS News did a quick teaser segment on that. There's going to be a longer form, and I encourage everyone to tune in and watch it on 60 Minutes, a longer-term 15-minute segment come fall. But it's a video of an FBI-confirmed Saudi intelligence operative casing the United States Capitol, talking about the plan, talking about the exits and the entrances, talking about support structures, talking about how close the airport is, referring to the people that work there as demons of the West. Now, why is it that the 9/11 Commission didn't see that? I don't know that answer. Why is it that people like Assistant Deputy Director of the CIA, Mike Morrell, hasn't seen it? I don't know that answer. Why is it that George Tenet, the CIA director, hasn't seen it? I don't know that answer, but what they've said publicly is that in light of this new evidence, it warrants further investigation. Mm-hmm. And had they known that this video existed, quite frankly, it could have been that we rewrite the course of the entire history of what happened.
And just to amplify that a little bit, that particular video was made, and the Saudi intelligence agent who did it was Omar Bayoumi, who was the same guy who meets the two hijackers, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who flew from a al-Qaeda planning summit in Kuala Lumpur through Thailand into Los Angeles in January of 2000, and Bayoumi, through means that still seem murky, somehow hooks up with these two guys who didn't speak English, knew nobody in the United States, takes them to San Diego, gets them a bank account, gets them an apartment, and provides a whole logistical support network for these two Saudi hijackers.
Everything's by chance, right? So Bayoumi is the guy that's filming the United States Capitol building talking about how to basically take it out, is the same Bayoumi who is hosting the hijackers in his apartment for a hijacker welcoming party. And
it's not murky anymore.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brett.
Tell us. Well,
It's not murky.
Let's let
No,
Terry,
Brett's doing a great job.
Let's let Terry weigh in.
I just want to make clear, it's not murky anymore. Go ahead,
so
Brett.
this individual, Bayoumi, his excuse is everything is just a massive coincidence. He happens to eat lunch at a Mediterranean restaurant in Southern California, and he overhears two individuals talking, "Oh, that's a familiar dialect. Let me go introduce myself." And they strike up this conversation, and 2 weeks later, he's opening checking accounts for. This is the best friend to have, right? I wish I had a friend like this. I wish I met somebody in a restaurant that would open up a bank account for me, that would drive me around town, that would introduce me to other key players, key operatives in this massive conspiracy. And what we know, and I think a lot of people in this room would agree with me if you've read the 9/11 Commission report, is that Al-Qaeda didn't do anything without meticulous planning. So if you send 19 hijackers here that have no English, no knowledge of Western culture, no money, how the hell did they pull off the most consequential and devastating attack in this country with no help? They had a support network. And everything that we've uncovered is peeling back the layers of that support network, and all roads point to Saudi Arabia. But that's a very uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people to have.
So, Terry, continuing on the theme, on this theme and the evidence that Brett is referring to, at the same time, this guy Bayoumi was in telephone contact with a number of interesting individuals, the imam at the Saudi-funded mosque in Culver City, and also people at the Saudi embassy in
Yes,
Washington.
so what we know now is that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was running an anti-American, pro-jihadist program within the Ministry of Islamic Affairs in the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. The key players there also tasked al-Bayoumi and al-Thumari to meet and greet the hijackers and do what Brett was just telling you. In addition, there have been 30 Saudi nationals that have been unmasked now that we saw on July 31st in our hearing, but the FBI is clawing back at that evidence becoming public for all of you to see. We are fighting that as well. We want the evidence out there. We want everyone to understand that it was the kingdom, it was their agents that tasked the hijackers and then helped them with everything that they needed, every single thing. And there was an advance team. This has never been known before, right, Brett?
Yeah, so Terry, I just want to point out one thing. To be fair, when you look at Saudi Arabia, it's really there's the royal family, which is the ruling party, but then there's the secular piece of Saudi Arabia, and you can't look at Saudi Arabia in a vacuum. And there's really two elements that control the country. So when we're talking about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, we're referring to an element within it. It's not that the king said, "Oh, let's go attack America." Or, Prince said, "Let's go attack America." That's not the case. What we're saying is that the Ministry of Islamic Affairs is where the cancer resided. And it was through that ministry that they were able to develop this support network. So it's very important to differentiate between the king and the ruling crown prince and the royal family, and then the more religious, radical elements within the government that are the pro-jihadist, anti-West, Wahhabi elements within that government. And that is where we see this support network coming from. It's all within the ministry. It's within that one department. It's almost akin to like the way the United States is set up, is we have the Department of Education, we have the Department of Agriculture. So Saudi Arabia has the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, and that's where we've been able to find sort of the smoking gun, if you will, of
Right.
the support network.
And you have to go back to the 1990s and what was happening, that the kingdom was exporting extremism all around the world. They were building their mosques at an incredible rate and filling them with extremists. That was the part of Moya, that was their job. In order for the kingdom to have its legitimacy, they had to give the Wahhabists and the extremists what they wanted. That's just the way it worked in the kingdom. But when you export extremism, the United States was not immune to that. The King Fahd Mosque out in California was a hornet's nest of extremists, and some of the worst possible ones, like the really down and dirty guys. And in that mosque is where the extremists were and where they were also recruiting these people, and the hatred was there. Saudi Arabia preached the hatred too through their madrasa schools that they were building at a huge rate in Pakistan and all over in the Middle East, all to poison the minds of their youth to hate Americans and kill us. We're the infidels. And that came to the United States. But it is the kingdom that gave the financial support to al-Qaeda for years. Nobody even denies that anymore. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he admits that happened. So they were given the financial support to al-Qaeda. Well, when al-Qaeda comes to the United States and murders Americans on U.S. soil, you don't get to throw your hands up in the air and say, we had nothing to do with it. Yes, you did. You financed it. And then you put your agents here, and then they carried out the attacks.
And actually, Saudi Arabia didn't really cooperate much with the United States government after 9/11. It wasn't until Saudi Arabia itself got hit by al-Qaeda that then they finally said, oh no, that can't happen here. And that's when you saw a larger cooperation between the intelligence community of the United States and Saudi Arabia.
Of course, as somebody who covered this story from the beginning, there's also the question as to whether the U.S. government cooperated with itself. Because as is well known and has been reported for years, the CIA knew these guys had come to Southern California. They tracked them from that planning summit in Kuala Lumpur, which they had under surveillance, through to Thailand, through to their plane tickets and visas to the United States. How is it, Charlie, that we are just learning all this new stuff now when the government itself, or elements of our government, had pieces of the puzzle right there in front of it?
Yeah, Charlie.
Yeah. I mean, Bayoumi has been this
I have nobody else to put on the spot on this, so
Bayoumi has been this mysterious figure. He shows up in the 9/11 Commission report. They went and interviewed him under this very controlled circumstance. More than anyone else, he's been this sort of spectral presence in trying to understand what happened here. The video you guys got out is certainly, jaw-dropping. You're like, oh, there he is. He's, oh, I'm just a tourist who's really interested in the security protocols of this, US
And by
Capitol.
the way, they did say in the 9/11 Commission report that there's no evidence Bayoumi had any radical Islamist
Because they didn't have the
tendencies.
evidence. They didn't have this evidence. The
Yeah, there's
FBI
this-
did not. Go ahead and tell them about the plane drawing.
Well, there's this, what frustrates our community is that you hear, well, the 9/11 Commission report, the 9/11 Commission report. In fact, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in court uses the 9/11 Commission report as one of their defenses. But the 9/11 Commission report, we all have to remember, was written in 2004, and there was a secret FBI investigation that happened for a decade after the conclusion of the 9/11 Commission report. That FBI operation was called Operation Encore. We now know of that thanks to the Biden presidential executive order. All of those documents are starting to come to light. So how can the 9/11 Commission report come to any verifiable conclusions when you have a decade's worth of hard-knocking, gumshoe FBI agents out there pounding the pavement, amassing all this evidence? One of the things Terry pointed out, in addition to the video, Mr. Bayoumi has a yellow notepad, and on the notepad is a sketch of an airplane, and next to the airplane is an algorithm. And the FBI went to pilots, Navy pilots who flew the routes of these planes, and they said, what does this mean? And they said, oh, geez, well, that's a really rudimentary way to kind of figure out how to hit a target on a horizon. This is in Bayoumi's apartment next to the video of the Capitol. And the excuse by the Kingdom lawyers is, oh, he was helping his son do math homework. So there's this series of, it's laughable. I heard somebody laugh. The courtroom laughed. And it's this series of these crazy coincidences. Oh, he wasn't involved in radical Wahhabi jihad terror. No, he was just at a restaurant. Oh, he wasn't. No, that was just his son doing math homework. Oh, he wasn't filming the Capitol. He was, you see, there's a cute little squirrel in that video there.
Dennis, as a veteran federal terrorism prosecutor, is there a prosecutable case against the Saudis for 9/11?
Oh, my Lord. What a question.
We got 1 minute left.
Well, yeah, in 1 minute. What a question. Is there a prosecutable case against the government? I will tell you, well, one, I don't know the evidence, right, as well as Brett and Terry do. Quite frankly, it wasn't my case, so I don't know the evidence as well. I would want to see the evidence. I will give you my editorial comment. I don't think that would, politically, I don't think that would fly. I think there would be folks in the national security community who would argue that even if there was merit to it, that the greater national security good would, suggest a declination of the prosecution. I'm just sort of laying it out.
So I can help you out here, though, for a second. No, I'll throw you a line. No, we're not saying that the current government in any capacity had anything to do with 9/11. It's the previous regime, it's the previous government. So to say that we're going to end relations with the kingdom based on something that happened 23 years ago, I don't think is fair. I think that the kingdom really does have a place with being a transactional partner, having a way for us to establish a presence in the Middle East. Look, they stabilize world oil markets. There's a lot of things that the kingdom does, but that doesn't absolve them from the sins of their past. Right. And that doesn't mean that victims like me and Terry have to stand here and wait 23 years to finally find answers. Yeah,
and let me just add, if there are individuals, like if we can funnel it down to find particular individuals who are particularly culpable, then the answer is yes.
We could continue this discussion. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'll just close with the point that I hope that on the 46th anniversary of 9/11, we will have had closure on the military commissions case and gotten to the bottom of the Saudi role in 9/11. Thank you very much.